you everyone for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you, Nancy, for putting this together, and I'm sure Jamil from Franklin was the one who also put this together, so thanking him in spirit. So I'm Elise. I'm part of the Franklin Freedom Team. So we do similar to what Walpole does. I don't know how many members you have in Walpole at this time, but we have the same kind of community members, like the police chief, superintendent, trauma clinician, legal advice, all that stuff. So I'm glad that all of you were able to be here tonight. I know September can be a busy month for a lot of people, so I appreciate you guys coming out. Are there any particular questions? So this presentation is going to focus specifically on how to respond to community trauma. So when a community faces the collective event of a trauma. So does anyone have any questions before I jump into the presentation? I try to make it as basic as possible if you don't have a clinical background. So
thank you.
Are you going to be presenting it in terms of those who are on the Freedom Team or in the community itself as just a resident?
Yeah, more the community in
Okay.
general. Yeah. All right, so I'll jump into. So the first thing, so with the trauma, so understanding what it actually is when someone experiences what's called trauma, like either a lowercase t or a capital T. So sometimes people capitalize it, that means it was a traumatic event. But lowercase, sometimes they'll refer to more complex trauma, like trauma that's built over time or trauma that people have experienced since childhood. I personally, as a clinician, don't think there's really much difference. The response tends to be pretty similar, whether it's one event or whether it's a series of events over somebody's life. So the first thing to really understand is the stress response system. So we're all built to experience stress. So without stress, the human race probably wouldn't be as far as it is. Stress is really what makes us move. So there's good stress, which, if you're ramping up to take a test or you're ramping up because there's a big move coming, it's stressful. But it's also an exciting thing, and it's something that your body gets you prepared for it physically. And the next slide goes a little bit into what the physical response looks like. So there's good stress and there's bad stress. So good stress is when, it gives me anxiety, but I can cope with it. I know I have these study skills for this test. I can figure it out. I know I'm going to feel prepared, and I'm feeling good. I'm excited to take this test. But bad stress is particularly when we experience something that inhibits our ability to cope. So if we get to the point where we cannot cope, so for example, a traumatic car accident or being physically abused as a child, something that you can't get away from, you don't have control over it, and you really lose the ability to cope, and that's when the body goes into overdrive with these physical responses that can really have a negative effect on somebody's health. So fight or flight, so that's what people usually think of when they think of stress a lot. And again, that comes from the time when we were cavemen. We lived wherever we were, on the safari or the mountains, or where we would face, saber-toothed tigers or, woolly mammoths, whatever we would come across in those times. Our body would kick in because we had to run. If we didn't run, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't have survived as a species. So when we talk about trauma, stress is not the bad thing. It turns into a bad thing when it goes beyond our ability to cope. So some of the effects of long-term stress, for example, so one of the big things in Boston, if you're familiar with the city, there's a 30-year life expectancy difference between the community of Roxbury and the community of Back Bay, which is literally like, what, like a mile away from each other. Like, it's like right there. But there's a 30-year difference, and that has to do with the community trauma of experiencing poverty, experiencing food deserts, violence, racial inequities from police, community institutions. So that's where a lot of that big difference comes with long-term stress. So when we experience stress, so the first thing, so the brain sees something that it thinks is stressful. So when we are about to take a test that determines whether we're going to do a job that we want to do for the rest of our life, something very high stakes, our brain doesn't tell the difference between that and being in front of a tiger. As far as the brain's concerned, that's the same level of stress, depending on how stressed out you get about certain things. So what the brain will do, the hypothalamus is the part of the brain that kicks in and says, oh, we're in danger, we need to do something here. So it kicks in with this ACTH, which is a chemical that gets the adrenal glands going, and that's what puts out the adrenaline and the cortisol. The problem, it's good when we need to move quick, and it's good when it's short term. But if it's long term, what ends up happening is increased heart rate, which leads to high blood pressure, decreased digestive system, the liver can get overstimulated with sugar. So you can see why a lot of neighborhoods that experience intense poverty, intense crime rates, people are literally sicker than people in more affluent communities because their body is experiencing this on a daily basis. So by the time they're a teenager, they are already going toward high blood pressure, pre-diabetes. There's a lot of medical issues that are already evolving from this. So trauma is really it's not just a thing in the mind. It's really a physical problem that happens with the body. So it's both psychological and physical. So that's important when we're talking about trauma. So we've all probably heard of post-traumatic stress disorder, so a lot of people don't know that what is the actual diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's acute stress disorder, which is more common. So that's if somebody experienced a traumatic event or complex trauma over time. If it's within 6 months that they experience the symptoms of flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance, which means you're very jumpy if somebody's behind you. If it only goes on about 6 months, that isn't PTSD. That has to go on for a long time. So there's acute stress disorder, which can happen more often. And then PTSD, which you're experiencing these psychological and physical symptoms for years, sometimes even after intense treatment. So we can also see there's a famous study called the ACEs study, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences. And what that showed was children who had even 1 or 2 or 3 adverse childhood experiences were much more likely to die at a younger age, were more likely to end up incarcerated, were more likely to have substance use or mental health issues. So it has a long-term effect, especially for children, because it's when the brain's developing. So you're building, from what you experience, you think the world is a dangerous place, and that's really your view on life. So it really has a big impact for children who may be in more affluent communities, a secure family, a loving family that don't have a lot of ACEs. It's a huge difference in college graduation rates, a big difference in getting a higher paying job, life expectancy. So one thing that we really want to think about, especially more conversation happens around this today than I think it used to, is the structural and historical trauma. So in the United States and other countries, but in our country particularly, we have this structural trauma, which is embedded policies that prevent certain groups, which are called marginalized groups in this country, from obtaining social, political equality. So for example, the school to pipeline prison system for children of color or children who are in poverty. So that's something that's structural. So we can see, you know, cocaine being a different level of sentencing than crack cocaine because of a certain race using crack cocaine versus those who use powder cocaine. That's something that's a structural trauma and a structural inequity. That's an example of what has happened in the United States. Similar to that is historical trauma, which is a set of events that are focused on a particular group of people that cause catastrophe. So a major example of this would be the Holocaust in Europe. Or another example might be the Rwandan genocide, or in Bosnia-Herzegovina with ethnic cleansing. So that's something that's a historical trauma for a certain group of people. So in our country, probably not surprisingly, there are groups of people that experience both types of trauma. So for example, Latinx individuals with inter-partner violence, and then there's structural racism that causes a disconnection from the community. So for example, if a Latinx individual is undocumented, they don't have access to mass health or what could pay for those certain services. So there's a double whammy as far as experiencing trauma. And Asian Americans with COVID is another example. So Asian Americans have experienced, you know, discrimination, Japanese internment camps, the Chinese Exclusion Act going back to the 1800s, and then again with COVID being blamed for this outbreak that happened in the world, and a lot of the rise in hate crimes with that. And one of the greatest examples in the United States for indigenous people, the removal of children, which went on to the 1990s. The child welfare system was well known for taking children from indigenous parents to put them in white families where they would assimilate to white American culture, the loss of land and structural disadvantage. So not only are they experiencing the economic trauma, but also the loss of cultural values and unable to heal collectively as their culture would have done had that trauma not happened. So those are a couple of things when we're thinking of community trauma. Those are probably bigger things than what we would experience in the suburbs of Massachusetts, but at least for a standpoint, those are two big issues with trauma. Any questions so far? So some types of community trauma, and we've actually experienced one recently, the disease outbreak was the COVID-19 pandemic, which was a major trauma that the whole world experienced and saw a rise in a lot of mental health and substance use issues due to the isolation, inability to get work, or having to go to work in dangerous conditions, which did more negatively affect marginalized communities, people of color who worked essential working jobs. There's also natural disasters as an example of that. If there's an earthquake or a hurricane, that definitely can cause a community trauma. Military conflict, which hopefully we won't see on this soil for a long time, but a lot of countries do experience certain traumas around that, if there's conflict in their specific area. Racial and social injustice discrimination is a big example of community trauma for certain groups who've been marginalized in this country and in the world. Mass famine or unrest, so there's plenty of countries that have experienced this as well, and of course genocide is something we always probably think of immediately when we think of community trauma. Things that, like I had named a few before, like Nazi Germany and Rwanda, Bosnia, a lot of things, Armenia, things that have gone on in a while. So when we're thinking, so what we take away from it is, bad things do happen and trauma happens, but there are ways that we can respond more appropriately that can help more people if we know how to better respond to it. So when we're thinking about response, there's community support, public health messaging, and how we do clinical assessment and intervention. So one thing that's really important to note is that the lack of response to an event that's traumatic is probably just as bad, if not worse, than the event itself. So many people can overcome traumatic events, like even things that are terrible, like being raped or seeing somebody murdered or a traumatic car accident or the Boston Marathon bombing. These events do happen, but with the proper support, people don't develop post-traumatic stress disorder. They may, but a lot of people don't. They actually can develop what we'll talk about in a little bit as post-traumatic growth, which can actually be a beneficial thing in light of a negative event. But if we do nothing, then that signals to people that, oh, the world is a dangerous place, nobody cares, and there's not going to be any support. So some of the guiding principles that we'll go over a little bit more in depth as far as responding to this kind of trauma is first promoting safety. That's the first thing we want to do when there's a traumatic event or some kind of trauma someone experiences is being safe first. Promote calming, promoting a sense of self and collective efficacy. So that's important to note, especially when we're thinking about different cultures that may live in our community. In America, we're all about rugged individualism and pull yourself by your bootstraps, and we can do it all ourselves. But in response to trauma, that typically doesn't work. It's not, there might be a few people that can do it, but it's usually a collective response that's more beneficial. And a lot of cultures that tend to think of people as a collective. There really isn't as much of a sense of self as there is in Western culture. We also want to promote connectedness in the community, which I think with COVID was very prevalent, that people didn't have that sense of connectedness. And also, even in the digital age, even if COVID hadn't happened, that's still been an issue, was that sense of connectedness. And most importantly, promote hope for the future. So with safety, as I mentioned before, cognitive behavioral therapy has this idea of core beliefs. So when we're children, depending on how our family was, if they were secure and made us feel good about ourselves, we had a good view of the world. So our core belief might be, I'm a good person. If I work hard, I'm going to get what I want. But of people who don't grow up in those kind of environments, people who are physically or sexually abused or emotionally abused, neglected, they grow up with this belief that the world is not a safe place, or I am not lovable, I'm not worth anything. And there's more people than you'd think that have that core belief about themselves and about the world. So some of these things for individual intervention, like say we're thinking about clinically, if someone were referred to a clinician, there's exposure therapy, which is really getting people more used to seeing the trauma. So if people are afraid of driving after having a difficult car accident, they're very slowly, like maybe doing a simulated driving, and then if they get comfortable with that, getting back into a car. Cognitive therapy, which is really based on how we think and changing our behaviors. So if you've ever done cognitive therapy, you sit down and do thought records and decide why what I'm thinking really doesn't make any sense and how it connects to my core belief. Grounding techniques, which are really about mindfulness and meditation. Also, not even just meditation, but even just clicking a rubber band against your wrist to like keep you in that moment. There's a lot of people who've had trauma that need to do coping skills just to stay in the moment. Going to a safe place. So if someone's experiencing inter-partner violence, there's domestic shelters people can go to, safe mailing addresses where the ex-partner can't find them. So we really need to think about this as a system, though, because, as I said, we don't want to focus just on the individual, but also on how we're doing the messaging around creating safety. So a lot of issues with the media today, I don't know if you've noticed, but the news tends to like ratings more than actually promoting factual news at times. So they can ramp up what things may, like only putting negative things on the news because it can increase ratings. And the more we see this every day, the more that's the messaging we get, like this world is not a safe place. They don't put things about, children creating charities. They'll put a minute of that on, but they try to really focus on the juicy stuff. So really limiting exposure to news and the effect that it has on children. Again, children are more impressionable than adults, so while they're watching these things, that's what they think the world is. Like if you were to ask a child, what do you think Boston is like? They would probably say, oh, people get shot every day. Like that's what, but there's actually a lot of good things. Yes, people do get hurt, but there are very good things happening as well. So really that messaging around creating safety. So a sense of calming. So it's important to tell people that anxiety is a total normal response. Like a lot of people try to be strong or, especially like if you're a parent with children, you don't want to break down and cry if something happens, but you actually do want to teach people and know that it is normal to have those kind of emotions. Like we've kind of made ourselves so emotionless in this society that it's almost a bad thing to talk about, and it's not. So if there's a problem with performing daily tasks, like let's say you have such bad anxiety that you can't walk into work, that's a clinical issue. That's when you really do have to seek therapy or more support. But anxiety every day is pretty normal. I would say more than 50% of Americans have generalized anxiety disorder, just from the way things are so quickly paced and how we focus on ambition and success. So some skills teaching people the skills to relax before the event happens. So we really want to try to do these messaging around, if there's like free yoga in the park on Saturday, trying to get that messaging out, or a mindfulness activity, maybe someone's doing a meditation. That's not for everybody. Meditation can be hard. It's not an easy thing to do. But teaching people, like, even listening to music, or putting on videos of cats or dogs, things that bring a smile to your face. You want to teach people that you want to know this now, because when something bad happens, you're going to be able to go back to that yoga or that mindfulness and remember how to keep yourself calm. So the next one is efficacy. So this is something this is really where the core of trauma hurts, is this loss of control. So when there's an event where you don't have control and you end up getting hurt, or you see somebody else hurt, that's when you really have flashbacks, nightmares, that hypervigilance, that low self-worth. That's all that comes with PTSD. So you want to give people a sense of control over the outcome. So they may not have been able to control what happened, because in life we can't control everything that happens, but we can control what the outcome is going to be. And teaching people that messaging. So as a collective, there is like this, having a sense of belonging to a group has a huge positive outcome, especially with post-traumatic growth. Like, there are even marginalized groups such as, black and brown bodies. Their connectedness to their culture is what keeps the strength and the hope to keep going, the resiliency, and to keep fighting those structural inequities. If people are siloed, that's when there's less sense of control. And that's what, people who've been kind of culturalized in American Western values can learn a lot from that sense of collectiveness. So having the confidence to have the skills to cope. So when you're meeting people who've experienced trauma, you could get vicarious trauma, which is kind of feeling that such empathy for the individual that you start to take on those symptoms yourself and start to have the flashbacks of what they experienced. So that's something that, you need to know what your coping skills are before you address trauma with somebody. So if you have a tough day, you need to know, like, oh, all right, I'm gonna read this book, or I'm gonna put on this album because it's my favorite album. And to know what resources there are in the community. So one thing that we don't know a lot of is where we actually get therapy. There's a lot of places with waiting lists, and it's good to know, who has it in the Walpole area, where they can take more immediate appointments, or where they may be walking clinics. So cognitive behavioral therapy is a good one that they usually talk a lot about. There is a lot of, I would say, a lot of criticism in that it is definitely created from a Western positivist point of view, and studies have shown that it's much more effective for people who identify as white than people who identify as black and brown. But it can be very helpful in kind of restructuring your thoughts around what the traumatic event is and kind of changing the behaviors in response to that as well. Building problem-solving skills. This is one that is important because, I hate algebra. I don't like it. I'm not good at problem solving, and I'm sure a lot of people will probably say the same. But having those skills is what you bring into your life. When a traumatic event happens, most people can sit down, let's say like the toilet breaks. Most people can sit down and say, oh, okay, I need to call a plumber because I know I can't fix this myself. I'm going to go on the website, I'm going to Google a plumber, I'm going to call this plumber, I'm going to make the appointment. People who've had like really intense trauma can't even think in those steps. Like, they can't get the first step, so they get overwhelmed at the thought of what to do, and they'll start using bad coping skills, like using substances or cutting, things like that nature. So that's important too. Collective meetings as a community, and these don't always have to be religious or spiritual, but just kind of meetings where people know that there is a community to come back to, because I think, in our society, that's something that we've seen less of, and we need to try to get back into that mentality. And the importance of family efficacy. So efficacy is important to everybody. It's that idea that I'm in control of my own destiny, and that's what we lose with trauma. So having strength in the family and strength in the community is very important. Any questions so far? All right, so connectedness, so as it sounds, it's just that idea of social support. So they actually, informal versus formal is probably preferable. That means that, using family or friends or meetings in the community versus having somebody do therapy, and I do therapy, and I'm saying this as a therapist, that it's more important that you have connections in the community Because there's a lot of, especially with anxiety and depression, there's a lot of, you can get that help just by having connection to other people. You don't have to unveil all your burdens to a stranger that you don't know if you can trust. So just reminding people that it is important just to have that informal connection. There are, of course, going to be times where the event is so terrible that formal support is definitely going to be needed. But just having like resource sharing, normalization of the reactions, that all that together minimizes the chances of developing PTSD over time. So if you have more social support, you'll see that the risk for PTSD will actually go down for people that have social support. And it increases self-worth, which is where a lot of people struggle when they've experienced a traumatic event. So in that vein, negative social support can be very damaging. We actually, with COVID-19, we saw that idea of the us versus them attitude, people who would get the vaccine and people who wouldn't. And we want to try to really stay away from that messaging that, whichever side you're on, that the other people are stupid. Like, we want to really not get into that messaging because we're all experiencing and responding to the same traumatic event. And we do it in different ways. So that's how people are coping with it, whichever way they chose to do. If they were going to get the vaccine or they weren't, was their choice in how they were responding. And we really need to try to support people with how they're responding in the most appropriate way we can. So training on how to access support, if we need to get formalized services, we need to get flyers, maybe public service announcements. Social media is probably the best way to do it nowadays because that's how most people get connected. But we do want to make sure we do things. So, also after George Floyd, of course, that us versus them attitude. People who believe there were structural inequalities and people who didn't. And there's still that backlash going on today with the one group saying that, we need more equity, we need more ability to get into schools out of poverty. And then there's the backlash to that no, it's back to that individualism, that rugged individualism of the United States, which has done a lot of good, but not always good. So I'm just saying that, America has a terrible culture, but it's just a certain culture, and we need to be sensitive to everybody. So instilling hope. So this idea in CBT is catastrophizing, which is the idea that when you're thinking something, your brain is automatically going to keep tumbling to the worst possible outcome. So if, for example, like there's a leak in your bathroom or something, instead of thinking like, oh, I'll just call a plumber, they'll fix it, your mind immediately goes to, well, I'm going to have to replace the whole foundation of the house, there's probably black mold, I've probably breathed it in, I'm going to die. Like that's an example of what, and people do this, it's very common that people catastrophize. So we really want to focus on, not doing that and getting more into the healing process. It's shown that those with positive worldviews recover from trauma much more quickly. So it's not, even though it's corny to say accentuate the positive, in this case it can do a lot of good as far as preventing symptoms of PTSD. So again, I've mentioned like self-agency is really something that's developed in an American culture as a white upper middle class view. And it's, again, there's goodness about it. I mean, this came out of the Enlightenment, out of Western Europe, one of the greatest movements of thought that the world, so I'm not saying individualism doesn't have its place, but it's overemphasized in American culture as far as, everything is about how you did as a person, like that myth of meritocracy that I did this, I'm the one who's hardworking. It's not because you know, I inherited my house from my parents and I had equity and I was able to get all these loans and do whatever I wanted. No, it was because I did it all myself. So there's always, you know, just reminding people that the collective matters. Making resources easy and available. One way Massachusetts did that, for example, was through the Massachusetts Behavioral Health Line. So instead of having people go to all these different places to get mental health and substance use care, they created a hotline where you can be referred immediately to services. So again, CBT, mass media messaging, like what are we seeing on TV, positive, negative. School messaging is important. Like remember, experiencing bullying is a type of trauma as well, and it can be a community trauma, especially if we see a cluster of bullying in the school system. So we want to make sure that we're responding in the same way, especially with our community leaders. So we want to focus, you know, who's actually going to invest in these issues, who are we voting for, especially in local elections. And the general elections are pretty much determined in Massachusetts what the federal elections are going to be. But the local elections do matter, and they really do impact us more, even more so than the federal ones, because more of our policies that directly impact us, the schools, the local emergency services, the response, the training, that comes from local officials, not from federal officials. And having that cultural sensitivity around individual and collective work. So one thing I added was post-traumatic growth, because I don't want it to sound negative that, you know, trauma's these big scary things that happen in the world, because they do. But there's also growth that can come out of it. And the way this happens is through these 5 principles, which are relating to others, seeing new possibilities out of this trauma. So for people who've experienced substance use, getting into peer support and recovery can be very effective. Personal strength, and I'd add collective strength to that as well. Spiritual change, this isn't just about religion, it's really just what your point of view on the world is. Is it positive, negative? Do you see yourself in a good place in the world, your connection to it? And appreciation for life. I think a lot of people today have certainly become very mundane in the way they go from day to day, going to work, getting in the car, coming home, making dinner, and the cycle repeats itself over and over again. So we need to find those little things, like if we like journaling or sketching or music or taking a walk, just something different to make it a better day is very important as well. So it's important to note that limited study has been done on healing trauma collectively as a community. So there isn't a lot of study on this. There's actually something that probably needs to have more study. And I think that's because, too, it's hard to get in the moment of a trauma, a community trauma happening and getting in and interviewing people, and that can be a difficult process. So that's something that we still need to investigate as a society, what would be the best interventions. That reminder that, you know, individual treatment is particularly Western view. So for clinician, like a lot of times they say, well, you can't speak to the family unless they sign a release, but the family considers themselves the entire patient. So sometimes we need to think differently if we're dealing with different cultures. And the focus on community healing, which is social accountability. So we don't want to have trauma be an excuse that, you know, oh, it's okay that you're using drugs and causing harm to people because you've experienced trauma. We can empathize with it, but we also have to hold ourselves accountable as a community. A sense of belonging and norming. And there has to be initiative from community leaders and the participants of the community. So no one is going to come in on a horse telling you this is what's going to happen. It really just has to come from all of us individually. And that's most of what I had to present. So these are just some references. Are there any questions related to trauma or community intervention? It's a lot of information, so.
Were there studies after an event like 9/11 and how it impacted the different racial groups? Or was it too broad to know who was impacted in different ways?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I know there's definitely been studies on how it impacted the perceptions on Muslim Americans and the rise in hate crimes against Muslim Americans and discrimination. I haven't read a study about how it impacted particularly like white Americans or people who identified as black or brown. So that's a good question.
And I'm just wondering, like, in how the access to healthcare and counseling would have helped each group?
Yeah, it's an interesting question in general, because there are a lot of cultures that prefer to deal with mental health issues as a community and as a family. So it definitely does impact who seeks services. I know, for example, with Asian Americans, they tend to keep that, in general, not as a monolith, but tend to keep that in the family and dealing with. So we do see less people identifying as Asian American seeking out formal services. And that's also true for some different communities. It's just not their preferred method. Medications aren't the preferred method, or even admitting that mental health exists. Like some people think it's, in different cultures, there's just an imbalance and you need to find the balance. They don't say like there's something wrong with your brain, there's something wrong with the physical balance. So that definitely impacts very much what different cultures will seek services. But that's true of also different groups. So for men, they will seek formal services less than women do, because there's that sense of masculinity and being strong and able to keep it in. So that does have a big effect.
How about access to counseling? Do you think that having, say if you just came in and you had open counseling sessions, do you think they would create a more welcoming experience, or having it in an office that is a little bit more managed? Has that?
I think it depends on the population. Yeah, I think, because for example, like I work in homeless services in Boston, so people will tend to come to open access more in a community setting. And will usually move to a private room. One thing I'll say about access, there is definitely an access issue with formal supports as far as rural areas. That was something that really came up in the pandemic, because there is not the same level of Wi-Fi in West Virginia in the mountains than there would be in the city. So even getting people that access, and the same thing with even in poverty in city, a lot of the children, you don't own a computer, you don't have Wi-Fi, so that was another access issue. And in addition to that, one thing that's come up a lot, so most social workers like myself identify as white middle-class females. That's generally what you find when you walk into a therapy office. And for those who don't identify as that, or either as a marginalized group, that's not beneficial because I can never relate to somebody who identifies as black and brown in the same way that a therapist of that background can. I can provide the interventions, but I'll never know the true life experience. And that turns a lot of people away who belong to marginalized groups, who, because of structural inequities, are often the people that experience these community traumas. So I think, especially as in the suburbs, what we need to think about is how to diversify, how to advertise, and definitely a major issue, which the State House is working on now, like trying to pass a bill to make more paid internships for people of color who are trying to get therapy degrees, because right now you get a master's that costs $50 grand, and then you have to do an unpaid internship and work full-time, and if you have a family at the same time, it's almost impossible. So more students of color don't end up finishing the program. So that having access to someone that you think would identify with you is a major issue right now. And it even is in diverse cities like Boston, it's still a major issue, and it's because of those structural inequities and trying to get more diverse workforce in terms of therapy.
Elise, can you say anything about a restorative justice, or I'm thinking the bigger scale, like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, or that kind of a community process that is maybe not very common, but
yeah, that's a good question. So it's happening more now. I've read studies, especially in relation to the indigenous community, that have used restorative justice, because it does have that it's a sense of accountability, but also a sense of healing. So we're not forgiving people for what happened. You accept the accountability, but as a group you kind of talk through how it came to that and how we can heal together. So what they usually will do is make people sit in a circle and then start with, check in, how you doing today. It's that sense of accountability. I think there's an example of when they were doing peace talks in Northern Ireland, for example, really talking of having the people come together, because one thing that we shy away from as people is conflict. We don't like talking about, we don't like having difficult conversations, but the more we don't, the more the hate will fester, So getting people together and really having those conversations is really key, especially when there's been some kind of violent trauma in a country or between groups of people. It's not going to be, a lot of people might storm out or start crying or, get into a heated argument, but the more we work through those discussions, and it's important to know how to facilitate them too. So, first creating that, what they call a brave space. They have all new names for it all the time, but brave space seems to be the one they're using now, where it's not a safe space, because, especially for people with white fragility, we don't want to feel safe, because that would be just not talking about race at all, So instead, we need to be ready to accept that feedback that, what you did yesterday to this person was a microaggression. You didn't know it, but it was. And you may, it'll hurt, but accepting that feedback and moving forward and saying, I'm sorry that's what happened. What can I do better? How can we improve? What can we communicate? So yeah, that's something that is definitely, I would say, a better way to treat criminal justice than the current system that we have. So, there are other countries that don't obviously have the same amount of incarceration as the United States.
Most of them, yeah, pretty much most of them.
you know, and they have lower crime rates in a lot of those countries as well, because people are given the chance to rehabilitate, not just be treated as a criminal for 20 years.
Are reparations, how does that fit into this? You know, that could be a divisive subject. On the other hand, it's a justice issue as well.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, that's one that especially, so, I mean, as white Americans, we have all benefited from the existence of slavery, even if our families were here when there was slavery or not. We all benefited from it because we've been given that structure of people who are seen as white-skinned will have certain privileges over those who don't. So we have all benefited, and there is, I know Boston has talked a little bit about doing reparations, and there's a lot of divisiveness, obviously, because there's a way, the way to pay for that would be taxes, for the, you know, either for people who benefited, or the institutions that have benefited, and no one likes it when they hear the word taxes. As far as the trauma, I think reparations would go quite some way in that process of healing, because I think until you acknowledge what was lost, like all that generations of wealth that could have been accumulated and wasn't, you're never truly gonna, like, you can say, oh, I'm so sorry, let's all just move forward, but that's not gonna replace what was lost. So I think that's a big part of the discussion. Realistically, if it ever happened, it would be probably a long way off and a very painful fight in Congress. But it's definitely, that's a big part of healing trauma. Anybody else? No, both of you put your hand up at the same time.
I was just going to ask, are there structures in place in the town of Walpole for dealing with trauma, whether it's, well, I know there's natural disaster readiness, but like things about bullying in the schools, or I don't know what else there, what other examples to think of.
Yeah, actually, Nancy or may know better, because I'm actually from Franklin, so I don't know Walpole in particular.
Yeah, I don't know about bullying, but if there were to be some kind of community trauma, Riverside Community Care has a trauma team that is able to come out to communities to support and offer counseling and group sessions and things like that. So there are agencies in our area that would be able to come and help. But I'm not sure about the school system, what they're doing right now to support issues around bullying and that kind of stuff.
What's the role that they recently filled for support? Was it through the health department?
Well, I think police hiring proposal.
Yeah, so the police also hired a mental health clinician. We haven't met with him yet, so we don't have a lot of information, but he's there. And he's meant to help respond to any mental health crises that are going on, either with individuals or a larger response.
And there's the Freedom Team.
The Freedom Team, yes.
So that's not exactly a trauma response to that level, but I'm not sure if I can, if I'm the best spokesperson.
We're a resource.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so potentially able to help somebody connect to services if they needed it, or just need a place to come and explain what they experienced and what happened, and, you know, just having an ear and people from their community being able to listen.
Thank you.
I know in Franklin, we do have a mental health clinician with the police as well. I think a lot of towns have gone to that because it's not effective for the police officer or the individual in crisis, so it helps. But I know one example, like when Franklin had their first Pride event, which yes, it was their first, and it was only last year, so that's sad, but I'll get that out of the way. But we did create like safe spaces when we had the event, because we just wanted to be prepared in case there were protesters, or, I mean, thankfully none of that happened, but if it did, we had places where people who identify with that community could go to support one another and be in a safe space. So just we're having, you know, if you're doing an event, maybe thinking of
Having a plan in
what would
place.
happen.
Yeah.
So literally there was a place, like a location
Yeah,
that people could go to.
yeah, and the
in the event of-
organizers would know where it was, so if something like that happened.
Were the locations public, or were they private houses?
Well, I think one of them was the Methodist Church.
Okay.
So we just, you know, they were around
Yeah.
that area. We had said, yes, if something happens,
Okay.
our doors are open to let people in. Because there, you know, unfortunately, there were some time, I think Elizabeth Warren spoke, and there was big protests from people who
Mhm.
didn't agree with her, that got kind of ugly. So we just wanted to be prepared in case something like that happened. Anyone else have questions? Do you have
What I was going to ask was, so if there's an incident where, you know, there's a community response, you know, where leaders may speak out, do you see examples where maybe that goes to the next step, you know, just not being this one time when they speak out? And say it was a racist incident, say somebody's putting posters up on signs or something, and you know, just looking to you know, how do we do something that might be more long-lasting, not just be, you know, this one event where, you know, everyone says this is wrong, or hopefully everyone says it's wrong. And I don't know if you have experience other towns or.
Well, we haven't had a huge event that's happened yet in one of our towns, but I do, I mean, I don't know, like, for this example, just recently, like, I think with COVID-19, it was kind of that idea of, like, more, like, that community pride was very effective. I think in terms of, like, you know, even, it makes me laugh when I think of it, but like when Mayor Marty Walsh, like when they had like 100-degree days and they had these cooling centers, but it was during the lockdown, so, and he was like, all right, I don't want to see anybody misbehaving because you're representing the city of Boston, you know, and it was effective. Like, people were like, oh yeah, I'm representing the city of Boston, you know, so I think those kind of responses, not, you know, not to be punitive, but to tell people like, yeah, we're in this together, like, it's not like whether you had, however you responded to COVID. Off the top of my head, I can't think of more of a racial one, although I'm sure, I would say Boston did very well in response to the George Floyd and the implications after that. That was not as good, but yeah, there are times, and I think just kind of focusing at that idea that, you know, you are part of this community. So. Any other last minute questions? I hope this was helpful.
It is.
So much.
I think the most challenging piece is knowing where social media can be cut off in terms of igniting some of that fear for people who have questions instead of reaching out to. I don't know how you would control that.
Yeah, it's hard, you know, you can't, obviously, we can't control freedom of speech, so
Yeah.
you're gonna have things that come up that are either misguided or completely not true, so I think we just have to monitor when those things come up and try to give opposite messaging, like just say, you know, this is what the facts are, if you want more information, you can reach out to this group. Just kind of monitoring, because we're not going to, at this point, the cat's out of the bag and we really can't stop it. So I think just being aware of that and having the team ready to respond to that negative messaging. But yeah, it's like every day, like something new
Yeah.
comes up, and it's exhausting in terms of keeping up with it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you.